We're here on page Yud Zion, if you have the pages, and we're up to the paragraph that starts with Minchas HaOmer on the left column on Yud Zion. And if you recall, Minchas HaOmer was a very unique mincha in that it is devoid of an element of kapara, as we discussed at great length yesterday. It's only a matir and allows you to eat chadash in achilas adam in the gvul. And the nafkamina is going to be in terms of our discussion about a machsheves shelo lishma. We have a machlokes about whether machsheves shelo lishma will disqualify in the case of minchas ha'omer. And we start with the sheet of Rav. Rav, if you recall, says that in this case, sula legam, if you had a kmitza of shelo lishma, then this carbon is not ole lebayel l'shem chov, but that's true in general in any case of shelo lishma. But moreover, it's not even a carbon kosher. It's also legam. It's completely worthless. You would have to throw it into the Beis Hadeshen and burn it with streifas Kodshim and ifsol. And the reason for that is because, with regard to other karbanos, we differentiate between the carbon itself and the kapara, so that if there was a shelo lishma and it's not ola l'bayim l'shem chova, but at least the carbon itself remains independent of the kapara for the bayim. But in the case of minchas ha'omer, where there is no element of kapara, then the carbon itself depends upon whether it was set up and singled out as an omer. If it was not singled out as an omer, he had in mind some sort of other zevach, then it's completely pasul legam. That was the shita of Rav. Reish Lakish holds that the halach of kshera el shelo olu l'bayim l'shem chova in shelo l'shma could apply in a different way in the case of minchas ha'omer, and that is that the carbon does not achieve its goal. Every other carbon has its goal, kapara. In the case of minchas ha'omer, there is no kapara. The goal is to be matir. In shelo lishma, says Reish Lakish, the goal is not achieved. It's not matir, just like it's not ol l'shem chova in the case of other karbanos. But the carbon per se, the mincha per se, is kshera. And now we're up to Rav. Rav is the third opinion. That's where we stopped yesterday. Rav holds kshera, the ola l'shem chova umoteres ba'achilu. That whatever the omer had to accomplish, it will accomplish, even in the case of machsheves shelo lishma. Why? Ein noeg b'minchas ha'omer psul shel shelo lishma klal. There's no such category as a psul of shelo lishma in the minchas ha'omer. And why is that so? The ein noeg psul shelo lishma el b'davar haroi liavoda. Again, we're going to see a machlokas exactly what that means. Eino roy lavoda in the case of minchas ha'omer. But let's just interpret it on a simple level. And that is that the psul of lo lishma, according to Rava, applies only in shar zvachim because it's an avoda that brings to a kapar. The purpose is kapar. Masha enkein in the case of minchas ha'omer, which is devoid of a kapar element, all it has is a mat. And in such a case where the carbon is a mat, there's no such psul as shelo lishma. So first we're going to begin with the explanation of Rashi. Rashi says that according to Rava, Kevan sheba misi orin, below michitin, every mincha, with the exception of the omer, comes from chita and not from siora. This one comes from Siorim. Eina ra'uya ela lavoda zu bilvad lahatir chadash v'lo ba l'shem carbon, and therefore lo nemer ben din l'shma. It's not ba l'shem carbon. And again, I'm going to take a shot at Rashi. I think what Rashi is telling us is something similar to what we discussed 2 days ago, and that is that there has to be some relationship to the carbon. When we talk about the carbon, we want to know what the Kohen is thinking when he does the avodah. Is he thinking about this carbon? Is he not? In certain cases, since the carbon belongs to a generic whole that comprises many, many different carbonos, it's necessary, it's critical to have l'shma in order to designate this carbon as such, as carbon X, whatever that X is. In shalol l'shma, where there are many other carbonos, and he has in mind a different carbon, that undermines this carbon. And that's clear. But in the case of Minchas HaOmer, we're not talking about a carbon like any other carbonos, where it belongs to a group, a generic whole, a collective entity with many, many candidates. And therefore the lishma becomes critical. Press this button, and this carbon will show up on the radar screen. Don't press this button because the wrong carbon will show up on the screen. There is no wrong carbon in the case of Minchas HaOmer, because Minchas HaOmer is the only carbon that comes from Siorim. And he's bringing now a Minchas HaOmer of Siorim. By definition, it is a Minchas HaOmer. It can't be anything else. There are no other candidates for this Mincha. If it's a Minchas Chitim, then I can give you a whole list of different Minachos, and his Shalol Lishma now underlines the designation of this Mincha. So let me see if I can fit this into the language of Rashi. Meaning when Rava said that there's no psul of shalol lishma because of ein no psul ela b'davar aroi la'avoda, means le'avoda of many different menachos, as opposed to the Minchas HaOmer, which is ein aroi ela la'avoda zu. It's exclusive to this particular mincha. And that's because of the material that comprises this carbon, this mincha, and that is siorin. And what is the purpose of bringing siorin? We have no other mincha that brings siorin. It's to be matir chadash. And therefore, you cannot say that the hakrava here was l'shem carbon. We're not dealing with a classic carbon like all the other menachos that are made of chita. And v'lo nemar din l'shma ela b'bayim l'shem carbon. If you need to bring it, because it's not obvious that you are bringing it l'shem carbon, meaning zu, avodah zu. As far as the spectator is concerned, all he sees is a generic mincha made of chitim that could be any one of different minachos. We need the lishma. We need the Kohen to indicate, to verbalize that he is designating this particular carbon for this particular carbon. And shalol lishma is a psul. But in the case of Minchas HaOmer, which is coming from Siorim, there's nothing that this mincha could accomplish other than to be matir chadash. And now we go on to Tosfos. Tosfos says, Minchas HaOmer eina reuya l'shum carbon acher mishum sheba min hachadash. V'chadash eina roy la'akrava kodem HaOmer atein eina noi bo psul machshava. Tosfos is very much on the line of Rashi, very similar. And he's pointing out that according to Rava, the concept of shalol lishma is inapplicable to Minchas HaOmer, because again, there's no other competing candidate And there's for no reason, therefore, that justifies that we must designate it and single it out for this purpose. But Tos has a different reason, not the way Rashi defines it. That Rashi says it comes from Siorin. That's not the issue according to Tos. The issue is that at this point in the calendar year, there is no other korban, not a mincha min achitim, and certainly not the minchas haomer of Siorin that comes min achadash. This year's crop, Lamazagan, was planted in the spring. No. It was planted in the autumn. Let's say it was planted in November. And now you harvest it at the beginning of the spring in, let's call it March 31st or April 15th, but it's not yet Tezayim B'Nisan. That's called Chadash. Anything that was planted in this year and it's been harvested, and it was harvested before Tezayim B'Nisan, when the Omer is brought, is Chadash. None of that Chadash from any of the species that grow from the ground can be brought on the Mizbeach. The first korban that can be brought min Chadash is the Omer that's brought on the 16th of Nisan. So the Minchas HaOmer is unique. It's Ba min Chadash. And therefore, there's no other competing mincha that's like this one, because any other mincha, if you brought it from the Chadash, would be possible until after you bring the Minchas HaOmer. So therefore, Chadash eino roy lakrova kodem HaOmer except for Minchas HaOmer. No other korban can be brought min Chadash. And that makes the Minchas HaOmer very unique. It's not something that could be mishtarayim, it could be mixed together with any other korbanos, because no other korbanos have that identity, that personality of being Chadash. Only the Minchas HaOmer is min Chadash. Okay, now we move on to another case of a psul mincha. And I think we had back on page, where was it? Page Dalet, I think it was. I forgot now exactly what the list was. All of psul, but we discussed Chasera, we discussed Avuda, and we discussed, Ribu Shiura, Miyat Shiura, and so forth and so on, and the psul of Machshavas Pigul, Machshavas Shalol Lishma. And now we go on to a different psul, a category of Tumah. Mincha she'nagabat Tumah v'nitmeis nifsala. Afim nagabat tful yom o mechusa kippurim psula. This is a Mishnah in Masechta Me'ilah on Daf Tes. Any contact with Tumah of any sort, of any level, is going to disqualify the mincha, even if we're talking about a mechusa kapara. Now, let's just review. A mechusa kapara is a zav, zovi, yoledes, mitzorah. These are tmeim. They underwent the entire process of purification. That means they waited Zayin Akiyim, and they went to the mikvah. Everything is ready, except for one thing. The next morning, they have to bring a korban, and they haven't yet brought that korban. That's called mechusa kapara. Such a person is not allowed to enter into the mikdash. He's not allowed to eat kodshim. And in our context, he came in contact with a mincha. And guess what? Since his purification process was incomplete, he did not yet bring his kapara. Therefore, he's still considered tameh as far as the mikdash is concerned. And therefore, if he has direct contact with Kodshim, with a korban, the korban becomes asul b'doras ben. And then we have a tful yom. Tful yom is a person who's on his only day or his last day of Tumah, meaning he's counted all the days that he needs to count. He just needs what's called Harev Shemesh. He goes into the mikvah before nightfall, before Shkias HaChamot, and now he has to wait until Shkias HaChamot. His Tumah as a Tvul Yom continues to persist until after Harev Shemesh, and that's called a Tvul Yom. If he comes in contact with the Mincha, then the Mincha has contracted Tumah, and therefore it's Psula. Now, what happens to the Evan if they went ahead and they were Maktir Bitumah? Or, for example, let's say before the Kmitza, there was a Maga with a Tful Yom or any of the other categories it's made. So Nitma Kometz, now when he does the Kmitza, the Kometz itself is Tameh. And they burnt the Kometz of the Mincha on the Mizbeach. Pile Plan, this is a Mishnah in Me'ilah, HaMincha Kshera. Wait a minute. We just finished saying that a Mincha Shenogabo Tuma, the Nitmes, is Psula. Now you're telling me that Nitma Kometz Vikrivua, Mincha Kshera? What is going on here? Obviously, we're talking about the difference between Lechatchila and B'diavad. Lechatchila, if he didn't go ahead and do the Kmisa or the Aktorah, then we would not allow him to do so because it's already Nitnes. But what happens if the Kohen went ahead and he was Maktir a Mincha Tmeah? It was Nitmes HaKometz, and then Hikrivu. They took the Kometz, they burnt it on the Mizbeach. Now we're in a B'diavad mode. It's the Minchas Kshera. How could that be? And here we have to introduce a very complicated concept in Kodshim called Tzitz Maratza Ala Tumah. We touched on it, if you recall, in Perek Tomid Nishchat, in Psachim. And we weren't sure if the Kohen Gadol has to be wearing the tzitz on his forehead, or if somewhere the tzitz exists, even if he's not wearing it. And we discussed at great length the question of whether tzitz maratz al atuma is only in a carbon sibur or even a carbon yachid. When we talk about menachos, as a general rule, there are a few exceptions. The mincha is a minchas yachid. So why should tzitz be maratz? Tzitz maratz on a carbon yachid? So what can I tell you, Rabos? I think that this Mishnah is holding that tzitzis maratza even on a carbon yachid. I don't know. Do we have a Mishnah in Me'ilah? I wonder if, Steve, I can trouble you if it's not too much of a tircha. You know, the Kahati Mishnah is on the other side of this wall. Me'ilah is probably in the second volume of Kodshim. I'm not sure. Check to make sure there's Me'ilah there. Now, when we talk about Ritzui Tzitz, as I said, Ritzui Tzitz is not an easy part of Kodshim, but we have to always differentiate between two dimensions. One is to allow the Haktorah on the Mizbeach, it's called Achilas Mizbeach, and the other dimension is to permit Achilas Adam. Oh, thanks, you found it? Oh, that's part of the challenge. Yeah, this is not going to. I mean, I can learn through Masechta Meila, we'll make a siyum, but it's going to take a couple of hours at least. I don't want to bother you. I mean, you have to take out a Gemara Meila, and then look up the Mishnah from the Gemara. You know, it's an extra tircha. Right. It doesn't tell you in Mishnayos. I mean, yeah. It's a Mishnah Daf Chaf Hey in Masechta Meila. All right. Steve is being very nice. Now, Eino Maratza Elo Lahachshir Es Ha'olim Lemizbeach Shenitmeu Ve'Latir Ba'Krova. Well, Eino Matis Yishiraim Shenitmeu Ba'Chil. Again, as far as Haktorah is concerned, we know that a kometz has to be brought and burnt on the Mizbeach, and now the kometz is Tmeah, and the tzitz is Maratza. So that now we could be maktir on the Mizbeach, we could feed the Mizbeach, if I could use that term, Tumah, because the tzitz is Maratza. But the purpose of the kometz is not just the kiyum haktorah al gabi mizbeach, but to be matir the shirayim lachila. And tzitz is not matir achila. V'nechleku tanoim ha'im maratza tzitz al tumas hashirayim shenitnu b'achila. Inyan sheyochel aleim chiyuv kores al hapigul yischayev aleim mishum meila. Now, the question is, how far do we go with this principle? How far do we apply to what tzitz maratza? And it works like this. There's a negative side and a positive side, like two sides of one coin. The negative side is that there would be a chalos pigul or meila. The positive side is to allow achila. So we said the following, that tzitz maratza al tuma is not going to be matir the shirayim b'achila. But as far as psul is concerned, that the shirayim lend themselves to being pigul, in a case of machshava chutzes mano, or nosar, if you allow the time to pass beyond the time allotment for achila, those will apply to the shirayim. Why? Because tzitz is maratza. So it's fascinating. It's tzitz maratza li posel, aval eina tzitz maratza le ach. So now we have three elements. Two out of the three come under the law of the protection, so to speak, of tzitz maratza, and one does not. Tzitz maratza now allows me to be maktir b'tumah. Tzitz maratza allows the shirayim to lend themselves to a psul of machshavas pigul, but tzitz is not maratza lehatir esachil. And all this is according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yossi says, Eino maratza. Chaf Hey Omer Aleph. Ah, means the last stop here is off.
Yeah.
Oh, here. Okay. See where the Mishnah is. No. Okay. This is a. What does he mean here? Maybe it's a. Is there a mistake here? Hey, maybe it's in Menachos. I was assuming it's going back to Me'ila.
Okay.
So you can take this back. I'm sorry. Okay. It's not really my fault. It's a fault in the transmission. Now, on both sides, before we have to end our discussion soon about the status of tzitz maratza in the case of tumah. We have to add the following: whether tzitz maratza on a mazid is an issue, meaning the classic case of tzitz maratza is on a shogeg, which means that he was unaware of the fact that this was tummy, so he burnt it on the mizbeach in all naivete, unintentionally, and that's called shogeg. But I'm not sure whether tzitz is maratza al amazing. If, let's say, he deliberately, knowing full well that this is tummy, and he's enjoined from being makter on the mizbech, he went ahead nevertheless, and he was makter. I don't know if tzitz is going to be maratza in a case of mazing. So for that, you have to open up page Yud Ches, and he says, "Machlokes kanoim hi beritzui tzitz." We're going now, according to the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer, that there is ritzui tzitz in the case of a nitma hakometz v'niktara v'krivua. Machlokes l'das braysa achas hu maratza, the tzitz is maratza gam al mezid. L'das braysa acheres eina maratza el al mincha shekarva betuma b'shogeg v'lo al mezid. However, that's as far as a minchas yochid is concerned. Avol the minchas tzibur hu maratza bein b'mezid ubein b'shogeg. Means that the tzitz is maratza even on a mazid in the case of a carbon tzibur. Any luck? Is it in Menachos Cafe?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay, so that's good news. At least we know. I'm going to make a note that it's Menachos. And you find the Mishnah on Daf Chaf Hey and Aleph. So maybe I'll borrow the Gemara in the meantime and see. The Mishnah says, Nitma hakometz vekrivo hatzitz marat. Rashi says, ve'amincha kshera v'shirayim ne'acholim. That's not what we said until now. So I'm not sure how to reconcile the discrepancy between Ara HaKdoma and Rashi. Yotza v'krivu ein hatzitz maratza. Hatzitz maratza al atami v'neratza al yotza. Okay, yotza means it was taken outside the Azara, and under those circumstances, there's no din of tzitz maratza. Tzitz is only maratza on tumah. And so this is where I think we'll pick it up in Mitzvah Hashem on Yom Rishon. So we'll have a Skype share if everything goes well on the fasting.